The station at K-Line perimeter was not meant to be permanent. Everyone knew that. It had been built quickly, cheaply, and far from anything worth naming, a stopgap between supply routes that were supposed to stabilize eventually. Eventually had been 15 cycles ago, and the station still drifted in the same lonely orbit around a pale gas giant that no one visited unless they had to. The other species treated K-Line as a punishment posting. Humans treated it like a job. Mara Ionescu arrived with 2 duffel bags, a cracked data slate, and a transfer order stamped so many times the ink had bled into itself. She was older than most new arrivals, her hair already threaded with gray, her movements careful in the way of someone who knew exactly where her joints complained and how much rest they required. She did not look impressive stepping off the shuttle. She did not need to. The station was quiet in the wrong way. Life support hummed, lights functioned, gravity held, but people moved as if the place were waiting to fail. Repairs were reactive. Logs were incomplete. No one stayed longer than their contract required, and every species blamed every other species for the decay. The station commander, a thin-framed Yalari named Threx, met her at the docking ring. His eyes flicked immediately to her transfer code. "Human maintenance," he said flatly. "We already have automated systems." Mara nodded. "Then you won't need me much." That answer unsettled him. Her first week passed without incident, which in a place like K-Line was notable. Mara did not overhaul systems. She did not request new equipment. She walked the station slowly, listening to the way the hull ticked as it warmed and cooled, watching condensation patterns near the vents, noting which corridors people avoided and which they lingered in without realizing why. She started small. A handrail resecured near Habitat 3. A pressure seal tightened in the auxiliary storage bay that had never quite sat flush. She cleaned a junction panel no one had opened in years, not because it was broken, but because it was dusty enough to hide a problem when one came. The station didn't feel better immediately. But it stopped feeling worse. That was when Nesh noticed her. Nesh was viral, a species prized for analytical cognition and cursed with fragile physiology. His hands trembled constantly, a neurological condition exacerbated by stress and low-level radiation exposure. The consortium had declared him functional with accommodations, then failed to provide most of them. He worked navigation support, a role that required precision and punished mistakes harshly. He had made none so far, but the fear of making one kept him perpetually on edge. Mara saw it in the way he hovered near consoles even off-shift, rechecking numbers no one had asked him to verify. "You don't have to stay," she said one night as she passed through control. Nesh startled, nearly dropping his stylus. Yes, I do. I'm assigned." "Not right now," she said gently. "Your shift ended 20 minutes ago." He hesitated. "If I leave and something goes wrong." "Something always goes wrong," Mara said. "That's why we fix it. Go eat." He stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. The next day she adjusted his chair. Not officially. Not through requisitions. She noticed the way his posture forced his wrists into an awkward angle, how the tremor worsened the longer he sat. She scavenged parts from storage and altered the height, tilt, and support without touching the console itself. When Nesh returned, he froze. "I didn't request." "I know," Mara said. "Try it." His hand steadied, not completely, but enough. Word spread slowly. The human didn't wait for requests. She watched. She adjusted. She didn't log everything she did because not everything needed a record. Some things needed continuity. When an automated recycler failed in Habitat 2, Mara fixed it before it backed up into an emergency. When a supply officer sprained a limb, Mara rerouted foot traffic so they wouldn't have to explain why they moved slower. When morale dipped, she didn't schedule a briefing. She made the common area warmer and replaced a light that flickered just enough to irritate everyone without being noticeable. The station began to breathe. The consortium noticed the metrics first. Energy usage stabilized. Incident reports decreased. Crew turnover slowed. They sent an inquiry. Threx forwarded it to Mara with a note that translated roughly to, "Explain yourself." She replied with 3 sentences. Preventative maintenance reduces stress-related errors. Stress-related errors are the station's primary failure vector. I am addressing the vector. They did not like that answer. They scheduled a review. The review panel arrived virtually, their projections hovering in the command chamber like disapproving ghosts. They asked about resource allocation, about why certain tasks were prioritized over others, about why Mara spent so much time in common areas instead of core systems. Mara answered honestly. "People are part of the system," she said. "If you ignore them, everything else degrades faster." "That is not quantifiable," one panelist replied. "It is," Mara said. "You just don't like the numbers." Nesh listened from the back of the room, his hands still now, his spine straighter than it had ever been. Around him, others stood closer together than protocol dictated. The panel ended without resolution. Weeks passed. No one was reassigned. No one was removed. K-line perimeter remained what it had never been meant to be, inhabited. One night, as the gas giant rolled slowly beneath the viewport, Nesh joined Mara at the maintenance window she favored. "You will be transferred eventually," he said quietly. "Maybe," she replied. "And then this will stop." Mara looked at him. "Why? Because you are the variable." She smiled. "No, I was just the first one who stayed." He considered that, then nodded. "Then I will stay too." The station lights dimmed to night cycle. Somewhere deep in the hull, a system adjusted instead of failing. K-line perimeter did not become famous. It did not become efficient. It became stable. And when the consortium eventually updated its models, there was a new annotation beside human labor assignments. Not optimal, but persistent. The annotation did not stay quiet. At first it was buried in footnotes, a statistical curiosity flagged for later analysis. But K-line perimeter kept refusing to behave like a temporary structure, and that refusal created problems for people who relied on predictions more than observation. Supply ships began to linger longer than scheduled. Crews volunteered for extended layovers instead of cycling out at the first opportunity. Minor trade cropped up in the margins. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just people exchanging favors and spare parts and stories in ways the station had never hosted before. Stability, it turned out, attracted attention. The consortium responded the way it always did, by sending specialists. They arrived in neat clusters, experts in logistics optimization, behavioral modeling, structural integrity. They came with questions sharpened to cut away anomalies. They came prepared to identify the single variable that explained everything so it could be isolated, copied, or removed. Mara watched them arrive from the upper catwalk, leaning on the rail with her arms crossed. She did not interfere. She did not make a show of greeting them. She went back to work. That unsettled them more than resistance would have. Nesh felt it immediately. The tremor in his hands tried to return, a familiar ghost stirred by scrutiny and expectation. He caught it early this time, grounding himself against the edge of his console, breathing the way Mara had taught him without ever calling it instruction. "You are calmer," observed one of the specialists, a tall Arthrex with segmented limbs and eyes that never quite stopped moving. "Yes," Nesh replied simply. "Why? Nesh paused, then answered honestly, because I am not preparing to be replaced. The Arthrex's eyes flickered. That is an irrational assumption. Nesh looked at his hands, still steady. It is an experienced one. The specialists spread through the station like dye in water. They measured, logged, compared. They asked why certain corridors showed less wear despite similar traffic, why error rates in navigation had dropped without upgrades, why people smiled more. Yes, one of them actually used that word during shift transitions. They interviewed Mara last. She stood in the maintenance bay with grease on her sleeve and a tool half disassembled on the bench. She did not stop working while they spoke. "You have altered station behavior," one specialist said. "Yes." "Without authorization." "Yes." "You have created dependency on non-standard processes." Mara tightened a bolt and set the tool aside. She wiped her hands on a cloth and finally looked at them. "No," she said calmly. "I removed the fear that made everything fragile." Silence followed. "You are suggesting," another specialist said slowly, "that fear was a system variable." Mara shrugged. "It always is." They left her with no directives, only notes, questions, requests for clarification that were really requests for translation. Take what you're doing and make it fit our language. She didn't. What she did instead was teach. Not formally, not with manuals. She showed people how to listen to the station, how to notice when something felt off before alarm sounded. She explained why she did things the way she did when someone asked, and when they didn't ask, she let them watch. Nesh began adjusting systems himself. Small things at first. A calibration here. A rerouted workflow there. He asked permission less often. Not because he was reckless, but because he had learned the difference between caution and paralysis. Others followed. The specialists took notes. The consortium convened. This time the decision was not about K-line perimeter. It was about precedent. Human postings across peripheral stations showed similar patterns when left uncompressed by rigid oversight. Lower peak efficiency, higher longevity, fewer catastrophic failures, crews that stayed, stations that aged instead of decayed. The models struggled. Mara received another notice. This one was different. Offer of extension. Role undefined. Location flexible. She read it twice, then folded it and slipped it into her pocket. That night she sat with Nesh by the viewport as the gas giant rolled slowly beneath them, its bands shifting in silent, endless motion. "They want to move you," he said, already knowing. "Yes." "You will go," she considered, "maybe. If you leave," she held up a hand, "you'll keep going." Nesh swallowed. "I don't know if I can." "You already are," Mara said gently. "You just don't see it yet." He looked at his hands again, still steady. "You stayed," he said. "So did you." The station hummed around them, a familiar sound now, layered and alive. Systems adjusted. People laughed somewhere down the corridor. A place that had never been meant to matter continued to do so anyway. Mara stood. "I won't disappear," she said. "Humans don't do that well." Nesh nodded. "Then I will stay." She smiled, warm and real. "Good." When the next supply ship arrived, Mara boarded it with one duffel bag instead of two. She left behind tools, notes, habits, people who no longer needed permission to care. K-line perimeter drifted on. Not optimal, not temporary, persistent. And that, the consortium would eventually learn, was enough. The supply ship undocked without ceremony. Mara stood at the viewport as K-line perimeter shrank against the curve of the gas giant. Its lights, still visible long after protocol, said she should have lost sight of them. She waited until they did fade, until the station became just another point among thousands, before she turned away. Her new assignment did not come with a name. It came with a pattern, peripheral installation, high turnover, persistent micro-failures. No single catastrophic fault. The kind of place that failed slowly, the way people stopped noticing until one day it was too late. She smiled faintly when she read it. The transit was long, long enough for rumors to reach her before she arrived. Humans were being talked about differently now, not with awe or suspicion, but with something closer to unease. Not because they were disruptive, but because they were hard to remove once they settled in. They didn't fix things and leave. They fixed things so others could stay. The new station, Lagrange Node Theta, was worse than K-line had been. Not structurally. On paper, it was newer, cleaner, better funded. But the corridors were too quiet, the kind of quiet that came from people avoiding one another. Systems ran hot because no one trusted them enough to power them down for maintenance. Logs were immaculate and useless. The station chief greeted her with visible restraint. "You will follow protocol," he said immediately, as if preempting a problem. Mara nodded. "I usually do." He didn't like that answer either. She started the same way she always did. She listened. The hull here sang differently, a higher pitch that told her thermal expansion wasn't being distributed evenly. The recyclers ran with a slight lag that no alarm flagged because it fell within tolerance. The crew ate in silence not because they disliked one another, but because no one wanted to be the first to admit they were tired. She fixed none of it on the first day. She learned names. One of them was Tessa, human, young, brilliant, burning herself out trying to prove she belonged. Another was Coral, Arthrex, meticulous to the point of rigidity because mistakes had once cost him an entire team. A third was Seen, Yelari, whose laughter had gone missing somewhere between assignments. Mara adjusted chairs again. She always started with chairs. By the end of the first cycle, people noticed. Not the fixes, the feeling. Tension eased in increments too small to chart. Errors were caught earlier. Conversations stretched longer. Someone brought food to a night shift without being asked. The station chief called her in. "You are changing behavior," he said. "Yes. You are not authorized, I know." He leaned forward. "Why do they listen to you?" Mara thought of K-line, of Nesh's steady hands, of a station that had learned to breathe. "They don't," she said. "They listen to the place, I just remind them how." The consortium took longer to react this time. They had learned caution. Instead of audits, they sent observers. Instead of directives, they asked questions. Instead of trying to isolate Mara, they tracked what happened after she left. That was the part they hadn't expected to matter. Because when Mara moved on, the stations did not revert. They didn't become perfect. They didn't become efficient. They became stubborn. They resisted collapse in quiet, unremarkable ways. People stayed. People taught one another. Small failures stopped cascading. Human postings increased. Not because the consortium had changed its mind about efficiency, because it had changed its definition of risk. Years passed. K-line perimeter was no longer flagged as temporary. It had been quietly reclassified as a long-term waypoint. Nesh had been promoted, not upward but outward, given latitude instead of oversight. He still trembled sometimes, but he no longer apologized for it. He trained new navigators with a patience that surprised even him. On Lagrange Node Theta, Tessa learned to sleep. Coral learned to delegate. Seen laughed again, loud enough that people stopped pretending not to hear. Mara moved on, always moving, always staying just long enough. When the consortium finally published its revised operational doctrine, it did not mention her by name. It did not mention humans at all in the headline. It added a single line to the end of a long document on system resilience. Allow for caretakers. No explanation. No metrics attached. Just an acknowledgement that some things could not be automated without breaking. On a quiet evening years later, Mara stood at another viewport, another gas giant rolling beneath her, another station humming around her with a sound that told her it would last. A young technician approached, nervous but determined. "They said you'd know," he said, "how to make this place work." Mara smiled, tired and genuine. "I can help you listen," she said. "The rest you'll do yourselves." The station lights dimmed into night cycle. Somewhere deep in the structure, a system adjusted instead of failing. And far from any capital world, far from any grand declaration, humanity continued to do what it had always done best. It stayed.